I believe we are live. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. U.S. China trade is a big topic and there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to jump right in. I'm Dave Rank. I'm a senior fellow at CAP. I deal with China issues here. Before coming to CAP, I spent about 30 years as an American diplomat, largely focused on U.S. China relations. But more important than me, I'm really pleased to be joined today by Kim Glas. If I described Kim as the president and CEO of the National Council of Textile Organizations, it would not do justice to the extent of her experience on China trade issues. Among your roles in Kim, I'm not going to get them all, but you were the executive director of the Blue-Green Alliance. You were deputy assistant secretary of the Commerce Department for Textiles, Consumer Goods and Materials. And you worked in a bunch of offices on Capitol Hill, and I won't go into all of those, but welcome. Good to have you here. I'm also joined today by my colleague at CAP, Ryan Mulholland. As a senior fellow, Ryan focuses on industrial policy, trade, manufacturing, and competitiveness. Before coming to CAP, he was director of trade and competitiveness at the National Security Council during the first year of the Biden administration, and he led the U.S. government team that negotiated the recently concluded Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, supply chain agreement as part of when he was with the Department of Commerce. Before that, Ryan held a bunch of different roles at Commerce, focusing on supply chains, competitiveness, clean energy, trade, and investment. We have a really good audience online, so I hope that this will not just be a conversation among the three of us, but also we'll have questions from those of you who are in the audience today. So if you do have questions, please just put them in the chat, and they will, by the magic of Zoom technology, get to me. So with that, I think we ought to just jump in. Ryan, let me start with you, if it's okay. Because the title of this conversation is a progressive prescription for U.S. China trade, I wanted to first put a plug in for the CAP's recent report called A Principled, Pragmatic, Progressive China Policy. You led the group that developed the trade recommendations for that document. So I hope you can take first of all, I hope the audience can take time to read the full document. I first want to ask you since you authored or led the team that did the trade section, if you could talk through the 2 or 3 main themes of that section, what you tried to highlight, and specifically, what does it mean to be a progressive trade policy, and how does that differ from U.S. trade policies of the past? Ryan?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It's a sort of pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to speak with all of you, and I must say it's a pleasure to share the stage here with Kim, who I worked with at the Commerce Department years ago and have certainly admired ever since. Lot to unpack in some of those questions. Let me take them kind of one at a time. The first one, kind of, what does it mean to be a progressive trade policy? I guess I would say it's 2 things. One is that it is viewing trade as a tool rather than a goal in itself. That previous sort of trade policy, neoliberal tradition, sort of trade for trade's sake, right? I think progressives view trade as a way to advance the interests of our workers, advance the interests of our communities, of the economies of ourselves, but also our partners and allies, and I would also add the climate as well into that. And that, in addition to just new and kind of a better way, I think, of organizing trade, to link trade with actual investment in our own country's competitiveness. Certainly I think previous administrations have tried things like tariffs, have tried things like corporate tax cuts, and have had, I think, little impact in sort of changing trade flows, for example, to the benefit of our workers. I think what progressives sort of say is that's because in addition to those tools, you have to also invest in yourself. That's where kind of chips and science and all the investments in semiconductors comes from. That's where a lot of the investments through the IRA have come from. And the impact is real. We've seen massive amounts of investment flowing into U.S. manufacturing for the first time in a very long time. And I think it's because of that. Progressives don't think about trade policy in terms of kind of trading market access in exchange for corporate profits. We don't want to trade market access in exchange for foreign policy benefits. We know kind of the impact of that kind of neoliberal trickle-down way of doing trade on workers, on communities across the country, and it wasn't pretty, right? So we have kind of a different way of doing it. And that's why in the report that you mentioned, we're very clear from the beginning that China certainly deserves some blame, a lot of blame, for hollowing out our middle class. Their predatory non-market practices really put a damper on U.S. manufacturing. But let's not lose sight of the fact that we ourselves have had some pretty poor trade policy, industrial policy decisions over the last several decades, and those have had a pretty negative impact as well. So it's about addressing sort of China's practices, but also improving the way we do things kind of on our own. We make the case that we can't expect China to change its ways, right? That we need to sort of play offense and play defense, and that you can do both those things and do them well, and that trade policy and industrial policy have to kind of work together to have the biggest impact that we can find. So I'll stop there. Happy to kind of go into any more of that in more detail, but a little bit of an overview of what we mean by progressive trade policy.
Thanks. Kim, I'm going to turn to you, and I mean, there's a lot there to respond to, so I will let you sidle up to the Ryan Mulholland buffet for things to respond to. But what stood out to me is, Ryan, your comments on the hollowing out of the middle class, the deindustrialization of the United States. And Kim, I wonder if you agree with that assessment, and to the extent you agree, or if you've got any sort of anything to add to that, and probably more importantly, what do we do with that? You know, if the assessment is right, that it's not just China, but it's U.S. trade policy, policies of the past, you know, what specifically do we do to respond?
Well, thank you so much, Dave and Ryan, for inviting me to this forum. I'm excited to be here. I also serve on the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission as an appointed commissioner by the U.S. Congress, although I'm not speaking in that capacity today. I think the report comes at a consequential time. Our relationship with China is complicated. The predatory trade practices that Ryan has been spoke about, namely around China's accession to the WTO, over the last year have crystallized even more with the economic headwinds that the Chinese economy is facing, unemployment internal in China, that is ramping up some of the predatory trade practices that are impacting industries in the U.S. and around the globe, to be quite frank. As well as she's continued solidification of power. So my comments are not about the Chinese people or any of that, but really about some of the threats and the opportunities that exist. This report lays out a vision of what policymakers should be thinking about to expand opportunities here, to level the playing field for our American workers and industrial base moving ahead, and while ensuring that certain defensive trade tools can be more easily accessed by impacted workers and communities. The reality is the tools that we have in the toolbox are outdated for the kind of time that we're living in. And this report outlines sort of how impacted workers and communities could better access anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws. You know, we should be getting rid of trade loopholes that give China a free trade agreement to the United States. We should be doing everything in terms of effective enforcement on human rights. And we all need to race to figure out solutions on climate change to address what I consider one of the worst heat waves ever to hit the United States. We're living in that today. So I feel like, Dave, to get to your question, there is no question that communities have been hollowed out, that once were powerhouses in manufacturing, that have empty factories, where there is no tax base. I come from one of those communities that every child now qualifies for a free breakfast and a free school lunch. And we used to make auto parts. No industry is immune to the global competition or race to the bottom. And we need to hold predators, all countries, including China, accountable when subsidies are being used to undermine our workforce and our people. And we need to ensure that the workforce of the future is still the manufacturing sector. You cannot have an industrialized economy, a modern economy, without a strong manufacturing sector here at home.
So that brings me, thanks, Kim, brings me to my sort of next basket of questions, which is about trade tools. And Kim, you talked about the need to update the trade tools we have. And Ryan, I know you've done a lot of thinking about trade tools both, and I want to get to offensive and defensive a little more in depth. But because, and I'm kind of an outsider on trade policy or trade tools, but it seems like that's the easiest tool for American presidents to use, or it's the one they've picked up most readily in the last decade or so. In May, the Biden administration imposed 100% tariffs on some strategic Chinese imports. The Trump campaign is talking about 60% across the board minimum tariffs on Chinese goods and 10% across the board tariffs on any imported items, any items coming into the United States. So, Kim, I guess my question for you is: are tariffs the right tool? If they, to the extent they move manufacturing out of China, is it likely to move it back here to the United States, or is it going to move somewhere else? And how do we ensure that tariffs don't just become a regressive tax on lower income Americans? So Kim, can I start with you on that one?
So, Dave, you asked an important question. I'm also interested in hearing Ryan's thoughts as well. But I think tariffs continue to be an important tool when used appropriately to help respond to predatory trade practices. It's one of the few tools that this administration has, and any administration has. But the ability for U.S. workers and industry to file trade cases is extremely complicated and cost prohibitive. So let's say you're a company that's being impacted by subsidized imports flooding in, and you're losing market share and you're losing your workforce. You have to prove to the United States government that you have been injured, meaning you have to lose jobs, lose market share. You have to be at a loss in order to prove to the US government that you actually meet a threshold for relief. I mean, that seems insane to me. And I think that's what the report is saying, that we need to ensure that these tools are more modernized, that when we are seeing predatory trade behaviors that are impacting workers and communities, that people can more easily access this. And there's actually a couple bills on the Hill that would do that sort of thing. The other thing is we have, and I'll talk about this shortly, but we have a trade loophole into the United States. Your product's less than $800. Guess what? It can come in duty-free, regardless of where it's made in the world, regardless of who's making it, with no scrutiny, no information, facilitating forced labor product coming in. So we have this great law, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, where leaders in the world saying, stop the human rights abuses in certain industries in China from accessing the US market. Yet, if you send it in a little box on an international mail shipment, it can come in duty-free without scrutiny and doesn't have to pay any of the penalty tariffs, the 301 tariffs, or any tariffs whatsoever. So it's one thing to have tariffs alone. It's another thing to ensure the effective enforcement of the rules that we have and investments necessary here in the United States. So we're investing significantly in semiconductors. We've invested in the auto supply chain, things like that, critical mineral production. We need to ensure that we're continuing to fuel those kinds of investments while using tariffs when necessary to try to provide relief to American workers and impacted communities.
Ryan, I'm going to get to you and trade tools in a second. Kim, I want to follow up a little bit, pull the thread on the de minimis rule. And I think I get this, but I'd like to hear from you. I mean, we had I think last year, the United States imported $4 trillion worth of goods in every sector. I mean, how important is an $800 package or a $200 package. Explain why that's significant and why, of all the things you could bring up, de minimis is high on your list.
This is the most archaic trade rule that exists. It was created in the 1930s when grandma went abroad and brought back a souvenir that as long as that souvenir is less than $5, you didn't have to pay a tax or a tariff. So now, fast forward to the year of 2024, we're all sitting at home clicking on buttons because this is how we shop these days. Nothing against shopping through e-commerce. But these boxes are coming to our doorstep, and many of them are not paying duty at all into the U.S. marketplace. They're not getting any scrutiny, and that's facilitating dangerous products, whether they're made with toxic materials, whether it's fentanyl and illicit drugs, pill presses, slave labor products. I mean, it is a batch of things that are coming in violation of our laws here in the United States. And so this tool needs to be modernized. This report calls for ending de minimis. We never negotiated a free trade agreement with every country in the world for nothing, meaning no labor, no environmental standards, no investments in workers and communities. It undermines everything that we're trying to do in terms of free trade agreements, modernizing our free trade agreements to have a worker-centric approach. So this needs to be abolished completely, and the administration has authorities to addressing de minimis, and so does the U.S. Congress. You know, there should be nothing bipartisan about getting rid of de minimis because it is hurting our industry. Our industry has lost 18 plants in 9 months, okay? An industry that has survived the Great Depression, the Great Recession are not surviving this, and it's rewarding bad actors. So if there's trade that's out of control, you don't just throw, a garden hose at a wildfire. You get rid of it until you can figure out a system that actually works for American people.
And Kim, while we're on this, and I promise, Ryan, we will get to offense, defense. I understand there's legislation moving in the House right now. Where does that stand? And I mean, it's Washington, but what's your prognosis for where we'll be at the end of the year?
Well, my Washington crystal ball has been broken for a while, but yes, the House did move some first step de minimis legislation. So it basically says, to sort of synthesize it, any item with a trade penalty on it, like a 301 tariff, would not qualify for de minimis treatment, which is astonishing that there's that loophole. So, hey, we're going to hold China accountable on certain products and put a penalty tariff, except if you send it in this way, you get the benefit of paying no tariff at all. So that has advanced out of the House. That would cover a portion of goods coming from China, but there's a lot of products that don't have a 301 tariff. So will it solve the problems facing the entire textile industry and many others? No. But our organization said it was a step forward. Now, the one thing I do want to mention is Speaker Johnson has noted he's putting together a China package. He would like to include de minimis in it. We have Senator Brown, who has a bill over in the Senate to abolish all Chinese products from receiving de minimis treatment. Same with Congressman Blumenauer. So this is a very active discussion. Everyone's talking about de minimis as a problem, but I don't think everybody's coalesced around what the solution is. And we need urgent solutions.
Okay, got it. Ryan, you have been, I think, champing at the bit to talk about trade, the modern trade toolbox, partly because you wrote the book. Well, you didn't write the book. You wrote the report on modern trade toolbox. So thoughts on tariffs or other trade tools that we have, should have, don't have, but are in the works?
Yeah, I guess, Kim brings up a really several great points, but I think one is just how dated our trade remedy toolkit is. If you think about, whether it's 301 tariffs or 232 tariffs or 201 tariffs, AD/CVD, pretty much all of our major tariff trade remedy tools date from the 60s and 70s, some earlier in the case of de minimis back to the 30s, right? And so we are fighting a modern great power economic rivalry with China using Vietnam era technology. And there's, we can argue about whether this tariff's the right tariff or that tariff's the right tool, but just modernizing the toolkit so that we're better able to reflect kind of the needs of the modern economy, I think is a big deal for building our competitiveness. I mean, just think about where we were in the 60s and 70s. China was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, right? We were the world's largest economy. Our industrial base was very, very strong. And perhaps more than that, we also have moved to a place where supply chains are now so interconnected, right? It's not just finished goods that are moving back and forth between borders, but that materials, component parts, know-how move back and forth across multiple borders many, many times before a product is destined for a consumer market. And so our trade tools are just not aligned to kind of what's needed in the modern world. I mean, we can talk about potential solutions. I wrote a report about this recently, but certainly don't claim to be the only person thinking about this or the only person with good ideas. I would just throw out a few things that we should think about. One is, how does the toolkit move fast enough to keep up with the needs of the modern economy and modern business, right? So, Kim mentioned earlier the need to sort of demonstrate injury. Well, there's a lot of situations where if you wait for injury, you've lost that industry. And so that's simply too long to wait. Can we levy the tariffs, trade remedies on finished goods that include a component part or a material that is subject to a different sort of trade remedy dispute, right? There's some precedent for sort of how you might go about this, but at the moment, tariffs are assessed based on the good that shows up at the border, not what's embedded in that. I might also, by the way, throw emissions into that. Should we be putting tariffs on embedded emissions in a product, given sort of the impact of climate on the whole economy? And then I think too, we have to think too about what is the market failure that we are remedying, because most of our tools sort of view success as a domestic manufacturer able to sell at price parity with some sort of subsidized or predatory import. But the reality is that the market failure is often much broader than just a company's ability to sell at price parity, right? Could be a whole lot of laid off workers. There could be trainings that are needed to prepare the affected company to be able to, not just survive, but outcompete and grow vis-a-vis their foreign competitors going forward. That doesn't even say what the impact of sort of subsidized import competition is on communities, right? On whole workforces. And so I think we need to take a much broader view, take a more holistic view of what the market failure is that you're trying to remedy with some of our trade tools. And again, the goal is not that some company barely survives, but that they're able to outcompete going forward. And certainly that is potentially a role for tariffs, but this is where I go back to there has to be something more than just tariff protection. There has to be investment, building out their competitiveness, training workers, expanding factory floors so that companies are more prepared to win going forward.
And Ryan, am I right when you talk about that last list of responses, that's what you put in the offensive category?
Yes and no. I mean, I think if you're responding to some sort of trade exposure and you're trying to remedy a situation, I actually put that more in the defense category. I think offense is more research and development, getting out ahead of industries, right? What sectors do we want to be leaders in the future? And how are we building and sustaining competitiveness in that space? I mean, certainly chips and science, trying to bring back semiconductor manufacturing is a good example of how you might do this. But what are we doing in quantum? What are we doing in biotech? What are we doing in sort of other industries that we all know will kind of drive the future forward? That's the offensive side of making sure that our economy is sort of ready for the future.
So can we talk about that a little? I want to talk about costs because I mean, my philosophy on policy is that if you're not talking about putting resources to the issues you've identified, you're in a lot of ways not really serious about the issues. So Kim, maybe can I ask first, whatever the trade response to as you've described Chinese predatory commercial behavior is, the Chinese are likely to respond somehow, and presumably that's going to come at a cost to the United States and cost to American consumers and workers and that sort of thing. Do you have a sense of what we should be prepared for as Americans as we pursue the kind of agenda you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a cost associated without taking certain actions when there has been violations of our trade law, including to an erosion of our middle class, our purchasing power, our ability to have consumers go on that vacation, families sustain themselves. So I want to put that in that context. There's certainly a cost to my industry that's lost 18 plants, of our ability to respond to the next PPE crisis or service our U.S. military, which our U.S. textile industry does with 100% American-made product because of national security technology and information that is applied to some of those high-end goods. So I do want to quantify that. That being said, I think your question, Dave, is really around what are the consumer costs associated with more tariffs and things like that. I know the ITC did a study most recently looking at the costs associated with the 301 tariffs, and through their independent analysis noted that it was modest costs to U.S. consumers, although that is an argument made by a lot of writers and editorial boards that tariffs cost a lot to American consumers in terms of the price of a good. So, for example, for my industry, you could import a shirt for an import landed price of $3, and the tariff is applied to that $3 cotton shirt. So that's a few cents added, and then that shirt is sold at retail for $25. So, sometimes in this particular environment with inflation exacerbating it, you'll see a higher cost because the trucker is being paid more and there's lack of workers at retail. So doing a full assessment on what tariffs cost are really important. I think the cost equation of not doing nothing is certainly hurting our economy. And in fact, I can only speak to my product categories, but since the 301 tariffs have been put in place, Chinese unit pricing for textile and apparel goods have dropped a stunning 50%. So they are continuing to subsidize this industry. Why? Because it's such a high employment sector in China, and they have such high unemployment, particularly among their youth. So I can't speak to every industry, but my industry is a lowest cost around the world. It moves there. It will find a way to come to the United States. And so addressing some of these things at the same time, what Ryan is saying, we have to play offense. We can't not tend the garden at home. What can we be doing here in the United States to help ensure that the industries that are being invested in or have long stood here in the United States not only remain, but have opportunities to grow next generation technology, research and development? How can the U.S. government help invest in some of those industries so that we are capturing market share? The Chinese aren't just investing in EVs and solar panels and clean tech, which of course always gets international. They're investing in everything. And so we have to take this in mind that while we have to have a relationship with China, I'm not saying we're decoupling. I mean, that's not, but we are de-risking. And I think everybody in U.S. industry who has operations in China are looking at this because there's been certain activities recently that make you think that I need to make sure that my assets are protected and that I am able to serve the U.S. market. And lastly, we have free trade agreement partners right at our border: Mexico, Canada, Central America. These are Korea, these are duty-free destinations to the US market. But what an opportunity for our free trade agreement partners, once they meet the certain standards, to have that market access to the US economy duty-free. So that gives consumers and importers opportunities to source more from other areas of the world.
Ryan, I'm going to give you a chance on costs, but also costs in terms of the kinds of investments you've been talking about. I mean, what's the scale of the U.S. government investment in that? And where does that money come from?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best example, I mentioned Chips and Science earlier, but I mean, you look at, Chips has, 50 billion total, about 39 billion to invest in semiconductor production in the US. And that's both kind of large fabs, but also kind of the supply chain around semiconductor manufacturing in the US. There's obviously other investments that have been in the IRA and the infrastructure bill, but I think, you're talking about, tens of billions of dollars. But know that in doing that, there's been close to $900 billion of private sector money flowing into U.S. manufacturing because of those investments, right? So this is public-private. This is certainly the taxpayer, the government putting money forward to say we want to maintain and build a competitive edge in certain industries. But by doing so, it is facilitating a massive amount of investment from the private sector that sees the U.S. as the right place to grow and to invest kind of going forward. And yeah, I mean, to Kim's point, that's taking place at a time when a lot of businesses are looking at China and saying, I want to, either build my next facility out of China, I want to move some assets out of China, I want to, be less exposed to China. And those two things happening simultaneously has been pretty good for U.S. manufacturing. And I would argue manufacturing in other places that are more closely aligned to U.S. interests.
So I see from the chat that we have a ton of really good questions coming in. If you're in the audience, I encourage you, if you've got a question, go ahead and drop it into the chat, and my colleague is pushing them to us. But before we get to that, I want to make sure I want to flag that I mean, there's a lot going on in the United States right now, but over in China, those of you who pay attention know that it's the third plenum of the Chinese Communist Party. It's an every 5-year exercise looking at, the third plenum looks at economic issues. And there's been, if you follow China, if you even just read the popular press, you know that there's a lot of talk in China about the direction of the economy, about sort of the question of whether and how to continue the economic reforms that China's been undergoing for the last 30 or 40 years now. Ryan, I know this gets far afield from U.S. trade policy, but I wonder if you've got thoughts on what might happen at the third plenum and what that means for the United States and U.S. China trade.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not a China expert, and you might actually have a better answer to this question, Dave, than I would. I mean, I guess I'll start by saying I'm an optimist. I'm going to hope for the best, but I don't expect a whole lot to change from the Chinese government on some of these trade issues. That's not to say we shouldn't continue to push. We shouldn't highlight kind of what needs changing, or that frankly smaller changes aren't off the table. I think China's leaders have sort of seen a global backlash against some of their economic policies. That you're hearing a lot about overcapacity. That's been an issue in steel and aluminum for a long time, but I think other sectors are starting to feel it as well. The U.S. obviously with its sort of 301 tariffs on EVs and on other sort of strategic sectors as well, but you're seeing other countries, Europe, have tariffs on Chinese EVs as well. There's sort of this backlash that China is experiencing, and I think they're going to have to assess whether keeping down the path that they're on is actually in their interests. I don't think it's a coincidence that you saw a bunch of U.S. CEOs in Beijing, a few months ago. I think China's doing the same thing with CEOs from foreign companies outside the U.S. as well. I think they're worried about business pulling out of China or investing elsewhere when they would have otherwise invested in China. And I think what they're going to find is unless they sort of change their ways, that trend is going to continue, right? And so I don't expect major changes coming out of Beijing the next few days and weeks, but potentially if they realize that a healthier, fairer, sort of more sustainable trade relationship is in their interest, then you may see some changes.
All right. I guess I'm positioned. I'm with you, Ryan. I am prepared to be very pleasantly surprised because I'm pessimistic. I don't think the prospects for significant change and change in ways that gets at the issues we've been talking about strikes me as fairly unlikely. Maybe that's just 30 years of having been in the trenches in the government where we talked about issues about industrial subsidies and the need to develop a domestic consumption within China as a substitute for a heavy reliance on exports. I'm prepared to be very pleasantly surprised that there's action on that stuff, but I am a little bit pessimistic that it's actually going to happen. Kim, I don't want to cut you off if you've got thoughts about the third plenum, but I want to get to some of the audience questions, and I want to start because I know one of the issues in the report we've been talking about was at the intersection of three of the report's sections. It was the trade section talked about it, the technology section of the report talked about it, and the climate section talked about it. And that's the intersection of what China's doing in clean energy and how it relates to both the U.S. China trade relationship and the global effort to combat climate change, because Chinese productive capacity, its manufacturing scale, it's hard to imagine addressing climate change globally without that. But how do you deal with that when those technologies and that commerce is at the heart of trade between the United States and China and the European Union and China, and it will be for decades to come? So I guess it comes down in a nutshell, who gets priority, the trade or the environment or the climate? Ryan?
Yeah, in fairness, Dave, I think that's a little bit of a false choice, because I think if you want sort of climate action to be sustainable, to be enduring, it has to have constituents here in the States who are benefiting from the investment needed to address the climate crisis. And that means, thinking about Americans not just as consumers, but as workers, right? At the beginning, we talked about what is a progressive trade policy. I think fundamentally it thinks about our country as a place where we want to make things again. And so, yes, China certainly has enormous productive capacity, but we don't want to be in a situation where we are entirely dependent on China for the technologies that we need for a sustainable future, particularly because a lot of those technologies have been made in ways that, used forced labor or have been heavily subsidized and sort of, dumped predatorily in our market and others, right? So there needs to be a place for U.S. workers to contribute to the future. And so that means, yes, China has an opportunity to be a part and probably a big part of the global effort to make and deploy clean energy technologies, but our workers should too.
I mean, there is obviously China, reiterating Ryan's comments, but expanding a little bit, China's access to critical minerals cannot be overstated. This is under this particular administration, we've seen a lot of focus on our critical mineral supply and the fact that we could be cut off and have been for certain critical minerals, and trying to work with other partner countries around the world, because you can't build a clean energy industry here in the United States without ready access to these critical minerals here at home. And so we need to develop the next generation battery. That's the technology of the now and of the future. That has implications not just to the EV industry here in the US, but it actually has military implications. A lot of these are dual use kinds of manufacturing that are important to help development of new technologies and industries where there will be significant economic growth. As Ryan noted, there is unfortunately this tie between, for example, polysilicon, heavily produced in Xinjiang, cited as a Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act industry that should not have access to the US market. But that polysilicon is being made into a finished solar panel coming into the United States. We can't have low road environmental deployment. We do need to help ensure that the US and other allied countries are figuring out how do we work together more closely on critical minerals, build supply chains together, and how do we advance this here at home. And getting back to the trade tools, because you mentioned it, Dave, in the trade box, how much emissions are we importing into the United States into a finished product? I mean, that's insanity to me. It's almost like, hey, this wind turbine came from China, but how much carbon emissions are embedded in this? And how many times does the wind turbine have to turn in order to make up for that deficit? And that's very real. Making some of these products offshore can be 5 times more carbon intensive. We're using bunker fuel to transport it across the ocean. That's insanity to me when we're trying to solve a problem. So I too reject the notion that we can't have a clean energy economy without high road standards. There's been some important investments made here, but we need to be doing a lot more.
Terrific. I have a question from the audience about U.S. China relations after the election, and we will not go into speculation on the outcome of the election, but let me translate the question to this, which is, what's your take on the prospects for improved U.S. China relations? Are we commercial relations? Is this are we sort of at the beginning or in the middle of a trend towards increasing friction? Or is this the sort of inflection point and, we will get beyond it to an era of a more stable, sustainable relationship? How do we know that, and what will it look like? What will we look for to see that we're sort of, that the relationship is stabilizing? Ryan?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I guess what I'll say to that is that, competition between the US and China is fine. That's the global market working, right? I think what people are looking for is not that, US China companies are working hand in hand together. They will continue to compete, and our government's going to continue to compete to take the lead on technologies of the future. But that, you want to keep it in sort of like the competition bucket and not in the conflict bucket, right? And so, that's what I would look to see, is the relationship stabilized? Is it fair, hard, tough fought competition, which is sort of very appropriate between, two of the leading economies in the world? Or does it bleed more into the conflict space, which I think is harmful for all of us?
I would only say if we think that the relationship is normalized, I don't think it is right now, because of the competition issues, but also because of some of the national security issues. And we're starting to see heightened tensions in the Taiwan Strait. China's posture of growing exponentially its military, they're not hiding this. This is part of their plan, has led the US and other allied countries to assess how do we de-risk, how do we mitigate also a heightened conflict, keep discussions going, but also how do we address protecting ourselves if certain supply chains are no longer available, including pharmaceutical products, things that are life-saving, critical minerals that if we don't have semiconductors, things like that. So I think we're living in a consequential time, and I'm not sure this election per se is going to change the trajectory. I do think Xi is on a plan. I think the Chinese take the long view, I think he is certainly taking the long view about how he is planning on moving forward with his leadership and what his vision is for the Chinese economy. And that's irregardless of the United States or any other country's reaction. But I do think you will see, if the U.S. heightens action on the Chinese, I think they're going to respond to that. But they are playing a different kind of sequential measurement of what's going on in their own assessment.
Dave, one thing I'll add on top of that is it points to the importance of sort of ongoing and consistent communication between our government and Beijing. You know, we are in a moment that is tense and certainly could be even more tense going forward, kind of depending on a whole lot of different things, right? And you can get through that a little bit easier if you have very open, very active communication. I think, you know, pulling back on both sides, entrenching and not talking to each other is a recipe for a much more challenging world.
Ryan, I want to flag that. I think it's a good point. And the report that I know our listeners are going to want to get to as soon as we're done here talks in almost every part of the report talks about the need for dialogue. Not that dialogue will fix all the questions, but it is a buffer to prevent competition from sliding into confrontation and conflict. I want to combine a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, because we've been talking about the role of government and governments for most of this conversation, but we have questions from the audience about both the role of corporations, particularly large corporations that have an outsized impact on U.S. trade policy, but also the role of unions, sort of non-government influence on policy. And Kim, maybe I'll start with you, your thoughts on what the appropriate role for those actors are, and how, you know, thoughts on how to best sort of bring in the input from unions and from corporations in how we address issues coming from China.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to get a sense of the pulse of what companies who are operating in China, what are some of the things that they're seeing in terms of their relationship with the Chinese government. To what extent are they communicating directly with Chinese government officials, and at what level? Also assessments related to, you know, subsidies and other kinds of unfair trade practices that could help provide intelligence back to the U.S. government, and so that we have open communications. I do think businesses have significant leverage. They're employing a lot of Chinese people. They're investing in plants and facilities, maybe even expanding operations in China. And so how is the U.S. business community coalescing their voice in their discussions with the Chinese government, and also ensuring that they're communicating any concerns that they have at the right levels? Because the Chinese system is very hierarchical, you know, and so it's very unclear when you are communicating to the government to what level is that message resonating to the very top. So that's one thing. Unions should absolutely be part of that conversation. A lot of these industries who have invested in China have also invested here in the United States, have a unionized workforce. And so as part of those overall conversations about assessing, hey, what's your experience been in China over the last 10 years? How about the last 10 months? I think unions should be part of that conversation. There's a role for unions to play in here. How do we have human rights laws or have trade laws that have to adhere to higher labor standards when there's certain foreign competitors in some of these operations that are playing at a whole different, not playing by the rules. So I think more engagement around these critical issues is essential. And as we're building out, investing in, you know, here in the United States and critical technologies like semiconductors, you know, how do we ensure that those are high road jobs?
So Kim, what does that mean in concrete terms when you talk about more engagement by unions? Does that mean, I mean, USTR is not doing a lot of trade talks now, but does it mean a union rep in trade negotiations, or I mean, you have concrete thoughts?
Well, I think the unions most recently, I know Ambassador Tai has done a lot of engagement with unions as well as President Biden when he announced his China tariff strategy, Roxanne Brown, the vice president of the Steelworkers Union, was right in the Rose Garden speaking with him. So he's put unions at the forefront, and that has also been around clean energy investments here in the United States, and the auto industry. I mean, so I think these kinds of discussions need to continue to help ensure, first off, you have a ready workforce, that's highly skilled, that wants to build out the next generation technology. So when we're making investments at home, how do we ensure that those are family sustaining jobs? I think that's part of the critical equation of ensuring these dialogues in the communities that need them most.
So Ryan, can I ask you a little bit about the corporate side of things? I mean, there is a huge amount of American investment in China. Most major U.S. corporations have major investments in China. Not most, but it is an astounding degree of economic integration. So my question is the business community a partner with the administration, with the U.S. government? Do their interests work at odds? And how do you reconcile that from a progressive point of view?
Yeah, another great question. I guess the way I think about it is, multinationals, big corporates, they have a, fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, not to the U.S. government, not to their workers. And we can argue about whether that's, appropriate or not, but just the way it is. And so it's really, if you want corporations to make different decisions, then you have to make the incentives different than what they currently are. And that's where I think, using the full complement of the tools available to make it in their interest to invest in the U.S., to hire more workers, to pay their workers more, all the things that we might want, comes about much easier from a private sector actor if the incentives are pushing them towards that end. And so, yeah, that means trade policy. It also means investment. It means procurement. It means regulation. It means tax policy. It means taking the whole suite of tools and making sure that the incentives are in the right place.
Thanks, Ryan. Kim, I've got a question. I think it's for you. Even if it wasn't directed at you, you're getting it. It's about fast fashion, and the question from the audience asking or highlighting the environmental, and I know you've talked about the sort of the policy and human rights implications of some of the trade in textiles, particularly trade with China. Is there a role? I mean, how do we address those? Is that a U.S. China thing? Is that a trade policy question addressing the environmental consequences, or is it a larger cultural issue that's sort of beyond the scope of the conversation we're having today?
It's honestly, Dave, all the above. I mean, we are creating goods that are sitting in landfills for 200 years. What I call disposable clothing. That's how I view fast fashion. You buy a $3, $5 top. You wear it a few times. Whoop, okay. We're not, we're going to throw that out. And we are buying more clothes today than we've ever purchased in our entire lives. At one time in the 1960s, just to give you a sense, about 10% of our income went to clothing. And today it's less than 1 to 2%. I mean, we have more clothing, and yet it's the cheapest clothing. And you do a comparison of jeans that you buy today versus in the 1990s, you're paying significantly less. But the cost has come to offshoring industry like ours, and has perpetuated this use of forced labor and other kinds of things, which I know consumers don't think about when they're out shopping. And they're looking for the lowest price because they may not be making the wages to buy what they used to buy in the 1990s. You see how this problem is perpetuating itself. So what can the U.S. government do? Close de minimis. A lot of fast fashion like Shein and Temu is coming in exactly this way, and it's getting rewarded. We need to be educating people more about these issues and the environmental implications. But that's not the role necessarily of only the U.S. government, but other NGOs. And on the environmental implications, there should be great thought given to embedded carbon emissions coming in from these kinds of imports. Also, what are the regulations needed to ensure that our textile products that we are purchasing are friendly to the environment? I mean, these are things my U.S. industry is thinking about. In order to stay globally competitive, my U.S. industry is doing a lot of research and development and already deploying technologies to do next generation environmental product in order to gain market share. So, we would welcome the opportunity, to be critical suppliers. Fast fashion comes at a fast price, and it's a price that's, I think, too high to pay.
Thanks, Kim. Ryan, I think probably the last question, although I'm gonna give you both a chance, in the spirit of BBC podcasts, what did you not say that you wish you had said? But before we get to that, Ryan, a lot of the U.S. China trade policy depends on cooperation with our allies and partners, Europeans, the Japanese, and others. And what's your sense of the prospect for that turning from idea into reality? Are our interests aligned enough with the Europeans, with the Japanese, with the Koreans and others, that there can be a global response, or is it really going to be a series of bilateral responses to different countries, or in the case of the EU organizations, response to the view of the challenge coming from China?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Chinese would very much like it if it was a series of unilateral or bilateral responses, right? The response is much stronger, has a much more immediate impact on China if we are able to work with partners and allies around the world. That is difficult. The toolkit to collaborate on trade actions with others is limited. There's venues to talk, right? We can certainly coordinate, and try to act in a similar way. But the tools that we have available to us in the U.S. are different than the tools that the EU has available, certainly different than a lot of countries in the developing world have, even though it's a global market. And so if Chinese products are kept out of the US, that doesn't mean that they're not going to continue to produce them. It probably means they're just going to dump them somewhere else, right? So you have to have sort of coordination in place. There's a couple mechanisms that could be potentially useful. The Biden administration created the Trade and Technology Council with the EU. I was pretty involved in the IPEF supply chain agreement, countries in Southeast Asia. There aren't specific mechanisms in those bodies to coordinate in a really easy way, but certainly the relationships exist that could be helpful. You could see something similar develop in the Americas as well. To the extent you can coordinate, the better. That's probably the best way to say it.
Thanks. Kim, quickly, what did you not say that you hoped we would have said in the course of the last hour?
Nothing. I think this has been a great conversation. I've followed the questions. Sorry we weren't able to answer all of them, but this has been a fantastic event.
Yeah, it was a great bunch of questions. Ryan, last thoughts?
I'll just echo Kim. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues. Thanks for all the great questions. I think we at CAP will continue to kind of think about these things and write about these things going forward. So look forward to continuing the conversation.
Ryan Mulholland, Kim Glas, thank you very much. For the folks watching, thank you very much. Again, the CAP report, a principled, progressive, pragmatic approach to China, available on the web. Thank you all. I think we're all